Remarkable writers of non-fiction in this country, and I think both of them need a big round of applause straight away. Ayesha Jalal has written a long series of books that have woven between the present and the past, between history and contemporary events. But one subject that has been the subject of at least three of them, and I'm thinking of The Sole Spokesman, Pity of Partition, and then The Struggle for Pakistan, to take things back to the original birth of the country. Partition is a subject which keeps reoccurring in your life. Do you think it's even relevant for today?
Absolutely. As I've said many times, partition is not an event that occurred in 1947. It's an event... I can't scream, but I'm sorry. Well, I'll try to speak into the mic then. As I said, it's not an event that happened in 1947, but a process with neither end nor beginning. Even as we speak, partition is happening. And one of the reasons for that is that partition is the foundational myth of the modern nation states of post-colonial South Asia, and so it informs your being and your way of perceiving. So partition is with us much more than we realize, and it's not just the partition with India, but the ways in which we partition our own countries within. It's a way of being and seeing, excluding people, making differentiation, rather than seeking power-sharing arrangements, insofar as partition emerged as a result of the failure to find a power-sharing arrangement by the two main opposition parties.
When I first came to this part of the world, I came on the back of watching Richard Attenborough's Gandhi, where Jinnah was given a very crude caricature. Your first book, The Sole Spokesman, I think sought to rehabilitate and to understand Jinnah.
Well, actually, my book preceded Attenborough's Gandhi, if I may say so.
But it was, nonetheless, there was following, for example, books like Freedom of Midnight, which very much took the view
I mean, in the sense that Mr. Jinnah has, by and large, received hagiographical treatment in his own country, i.e. the country he created, I don't think that my book was so much trying to rehabilitate him as trying to put forward an analytical argument that bridged some of the contradictions in the way in which partition and the creation of Pakistan was presented to us.
So what was your particular angle in The Sole Spokesman? I think you wrote it at the time of Zia.
Yes, I think one of the things I wanted to establish was the reasons, the causes for the creation of Pakistan. And because at that stage, the ideological argument was that it was only created to be a quote-unquote Islamic state. So I was curious about the factors that led to its creation, and that's really what motivated me to write this book. I was fortunate, as you know, because the British Transfer of Power papers had recently become available.
You quoted before that quote by Mountbatten saying that all we could do for Pakistan was to build a tent.
Well,
do you think Pakistan was meant to fail?
Well, I mean, I think what Mountbatten actually said is that it's a difference between setting up a permanent building, a nice hut, or a tent. In Pakistan's case, we are setting up a tent. We can do no more. Well, tents, as I think all people realize, are meant to be folded. What is remarkable about Pakistan, and I know that many Pakistanis worry about whether this country will survive or not, and that's been the perpetual fear. But the remarkable thing about Pakistan is not whether it will survive, but how it has survived. And in that sense, it's important to recognize that it did belie the wicked prophecy of the last viceroy, and is very much there. It's another matter that Pakistan still struggles to find the right balance, institutional balance, between its various institutions of the state, and hasn't been very successful in building institutions for the post-colonial requirements that it faces.
There's been a film recently produced in Britain that takes forward this conspiracy theory that the British supported the creation of Pakistan, specifically so that they would have an ally and a military port and base in this area against the advance of communism. How far do you think that is a...
Well, first of all, it's not a very novel thesis. Conspiratorial arguments have been put forward. And I can only say that while people with an appetite for conspiratorial theories can make of this film as they please, the British may have divided whilst they ruled, But I think it's a moot point whether it made sense for them to divide when they quit. There were many factors at play, and it's possible to take a random line of arguments and suggest that this was conspiratorial. But I think when you put things in, I mean, history is perspective. I think you know that better than anybody else. So I think it's important to put things in perspective and not go with a thread which sort of is unusual, but may not sort of be threaded so well with the rest of the stuff.
It's very easy, sitting in the present, looking back at the past, to consider that the current construction of events is inevitable.
Well, I think there has been a very unfortunate tendency in the more present time to argue that this country, i.e. Pakistan, was born amid blood and was created in the name of religion, and so it's inevitable that today it should face the problems that it is facing. What I call that Pakistan has been turned into a veritable Islamic killing field, but there are those who smugly argue that that was inevitable. I, of course, don't subscribe to the inevitability thesis. I think it's about human agency, context, and circumstance that led Pakistan to this path.
Jinnah obviously conceived of various different Pakistans before settling for the one that happened and agreeing to a map that he was very disappointed by. Do you think there could have been an outcome with a slightly different play of personalities whereby Pakistan ended up with a far larger territory? Or
well, I think the cabinet mission plan, as you know, was one such alternative. If it had been worked, but the Congress was not prepared to accept grouping, and that fell flat, and so they reverted back to really effectively the Cripps mission plan, which was the local option of allowing certain areas to opt out of the Union of India. So in that sense, it really wasn't given an option, and partition became necessary.
And given the plan which did in the end take place, the birth of the Pakistan that we actually have, what, in your view, were the main failures of that project? I mean, leaving the poor Muslims behind in India, the partition of the two different wings of Pakistan. What were the flaws in the plan as given birth in reality?
Pakistan was meant to be the umbrella, the proverbial umbrella, to protect Muslims across the subcontinent. And clearly with the partition of Punjab and Bengal, it became very difficult for Mr. Jinnah to lay claim on non-Muslims, in the non-Muslim areas, the Muslims left behind in the non-Muslim areas. So as a result, I would say that was a failure. Then the human tragedy of partition, the violence made it very difficult for the two countries to make terms. That was a tragedy. Kashmir, the long-standing dispute, has been a tragedy. So there are many failures to name. And of course, the fact that from 1947 to 71, the relationship between the two wings of Pakistan was anything but harmonious is another failure.
Again, do you think that given the geography, history could have been quite different? Could you have ended up with a united Pakistan today if things had gone slightly differently?
I think it was, again, like 47 was a failure of power sharing, to arrive at power sharing arrangements. Similarly, with some differences, 1971 was another opportunity to negotiate a power sharing arrangement that would be workable, and it's the failure of that ended up with a nation-state.
Your own family history has been obviously intimately bound up with the history of this country, and that wonderfully personal angle that you took in The Pity of Partition, talking about your, is it great-uncle Manto? Manto himself was one of the people for whom partition didn't go so happily. Could you talk about that and what you were trying to do in that book?
Well, I had, of course, looked at the partition of India. I looked at the causes of partition. Saadat Hasan Manto was interested in the consequences of partition, what happened. And when I returned to partition as a subject, I knew that what I hadn't done was to look at the human dimension of partition, and I chose to do so through the literature of Saadat Hasan Manto on the occasion of his 100th birth anniversary, and also to provide the opportunity to give my Lawrence Stone lectures. What's the problem? So what do you want me to do? Huh?
Hold it closer. Hold it closer. Or?
Okay.
Manto.
So Manto. So that's why I wrote the book, and it was really a different sort of a book. I mean, I am a historian of partition, so I returned to partition with a different set of sources, if that's what...
Talk a little about, for those that may not have read the book, about what happened to your great-uncle on arrival. He came from Bombay.
Well, Syed Hasan Manto left Bombay reluctantly, a city that he had adopted and loved and had made a career for himself in the film industry. And with partition, he realized that opportunities were not going to be that easy. So, and his family had left for Lahore. So for very personal reasons, he chose to join his wife and child in Lahore and moved and never went back. And in Pakistan, of course, he found it very difficult to find his niche. So he was always...
He had been a film writer.
He had been a relatively successful film writer, but there was no similar film industry here. So his opportunities were fewer. So I think the frustration of not being recognized and not finding his place in the country of his adoption did play a very excruciating role for him. But I do think also that it's important to remember that partition also made Manto. He wrote his best short stories and essays after.
At a furious rate of production.
That's right. He was really very productive, and he wrote, I think, his best work after 47.
Talk a little about that sort of fevered creation. It happened within about 3 years, almost all the great stories that we now associate.
Toba Tek Singh, the various sort of Tatwal Ka Kutta, I mean, you know, all of these stories really are a product of the post-47 period, not to mention my favorite, Manto's essays, Letters to Uncle Sam. So I think that some of his best work was done after 47. So even though he was torn apart, as were so many other people, I do think that he found, at least in his work, through this tragedy, a focus that enabled him to write some very, very meaningful and poignant
And again, for those that may not know the story, just talk about his struggle with censorship and his sentence of imprisonment.
I mean, the most remarkable thing about Manto's life, of course, is that he was tried for censorship by the colonial state, and he was tried under the same laws by the post-colonial state of Pakistan. So I think the fact of what changed with partition was something very alive in him, and this is what he used to say, that the pity of partition was not that they were, instead of one, there were two independent nations, India and Pakistan. The pity of partition was that human beings, after all this, were still savages, savages to their animal passions, savages to barbarity. This is what he regretted.
Do you want to read the opening quote?
Sure, I don't know what it is.
The wonderful quote.
Oh, sorry. In this land once called India,
Closer to the microphone.
such rivers of blood have flowed over the past few months that even the heavens are bewildered. Blood and steel, war and musket are not new to human history. Adam's children have always taken an interest in these games, but there is no example anywhere in the colorful stories of mankind of the game that was played out recently.
And yet Manto, in between these trials, between the difficulty of making a living, between a severe and developing alcoholism, did manage to produce his most extraordinary work here.
Yes, I mean, that is quite remarkable, but then I think that's something for us to think about and introspect, that maybe the shock of partition, the agonizing shock that he clearly thought about. I mean, he spent a lot of time going to refugee camps, listening to the stories of the people. And so I think that introspection led him to write some of the most extraordinary literature that we have seen come out of the subcontinent.
And do you think it was, I mean, the things he got in trouble for was his concentration on the sexuality of the violence?
That's right. I mean, he was tried for the first time by the British colonial rulers for order, boo, and subsequently, and there were several other sort of attempts, but then he was tried in Pakistan for Thanda Gosht, the first story he wrote on arrival.
One of the very greatest of all his
That's right, and it's
stories.
very interesting when he arrives in Pakistan for the first few months or even a year, he says that he can't write short stories. He says it's a very heavy genre. He takes to writing light essays. And the first story he writes is Thanda Gosht, and he is tried. He's booked for obscenity.
For those who don't know the story, just describe the
well,
situation.
It's about Ishwar Singh, a Sikh, who engages in loot, murder, and carries off a young girl, who he then plans to violate, only to discover to his horror that she had already died of fright. And it's about him becoming sort of impotent with his oversexed partner and telling her the story, and himself then sort of kind of...
And it touched, and she was as cold as ice.
And he was as cold as ice.
It's a wonderful, wonderful story. Do you just give a little bit of your own memories of him? Did you know him as a child, or had he died?
Knew him.
No.
I was born after his death, but I can say that I grew up in a household where Manto was larger than life, and I remember being able to say Aprati Gurgurdi Anks of the Betahana, the Mung Di Dal of the Lantan before I could say anything else. So I guess I really did grow up with him.
I mean, inevitably, like many writers, he was quite a difficult man to live with. What was his memory within the family?
Very, very fond memory of as far as his daughters are concerned, and they were my main sources. My mother, his sister-in-law, his wife, whom I adored, my khala. They were the main sources of memory. And yes, it was always a mixed picture. It was never, but I think that what Manto meant for me was that I always wanted to prove, I mean, if he was interested in the consequences of partition, I was interested in the causes. And I wanted to also know whether his stories were pure fiction or whether they had any corroboration in fact.
And by the end, he actually got put into a lunatic asylum at one point.
Well, no, the reason, that's just again a myth, because the only reason he was put into a lunatic asylum was the only anti-alcoholic ward was in the Lahore mental hospital. So that's why. It was alcohol and not mental illness that led him to that path.
Extrapolating out from Manto, under pressure, occasionally being jailed, even being put in a lunatic asylum because of his alcoholism, but yet producing his best work. Do you think that the extraordinary literature that Pakistan has produced is partly a product of the difficult circumstances of being a writer here?
Well, I think if you look at not just Pakistan, but authoritarian countries, it's not so unusual to see individual success, like Manto, amid sort of collective failure. So in that sense, I think it's also sort of very important to understand that in countries that have been subjected to authoritarianism, the personal becomes political. Because you're not able to articulate your politics so easily in the public. So the personal is very political. So I think a lot of that explains not just Manto, but several other writers that
Who are you
follow.
thinking of?
Well, I think Intezar Hussain Saab is clearly one of them in terms of writing. Then I would have to bring in some people from India as well, even though we're talking about Pakistan. But clearly there have been a succession of writers, and many younger ones who are aspiring and I clearly are admiring, have great admiration for him. There have been novelists of great repute as well in Urdu. But I do think that Pakistan has produced literature for which Pakistanis need to be proud of. And I don't think that it's only a story of failures, but individual successes can contribute to a sense of collective achievement, depending on perspective.
And in general, the popular culture of Pakistan has been extraordinary. Its contribution to art, its contribution to music.
Literature, and I think that it's resonating internationally. I think Pakistan has made a place for itself on the musical scene, in the art scene, also in the literary scene, and in the different ways. Individual Pakistanis are making an impact. Perhaps they cannot compete with India in the arts, but they've done well enough individually and making an impact in the subcontinent and beyond.
And if Pakistan was to produce a literary first 11, I think it would have a very good chance of standing its own against any. And
certainly artists. There are plenty of artists. They'd have to fight for a position on the 11.
The title of this panel was Pakistan at 70. So, just in a sense, go over what you would give the score sheet for the country. We are now poised at a point, 70 years on, where you can look back with a certain amount of distance. First of all, the successes. We've talked about literature, we've talked about art, we've talked about music. What are the other things you're very proud of that have been achieved in this country, other than the mere success of the state? Survival of the state.
Well, I do think that the fact that Pakistan has survived despite all predictions and heavy odds says something about the people and their resilience. The fact that it has been targeted by such excruciating violence, unbelievable violence in recent decades, and the resilience of the people, their willingness to still come out in large numbers to literary festivals like this, shows the extraordinary desire on their part to break out of this rut. And I think that in itself is a big success. It's the people of Pakistan and their attitudes that count the most for me as a success story.
So what else would you put on the plus side of the great achievements politically?
Well, I think Pakistan is here to stay, is what I think, despite all the problems. That's what I would say. And I think the challenge for us as Pakistanis is to understand that everything is perspective. And if you want to be depressed and you want to only look at the negatives, you're welcome to. But that's not a balanced perspective. As a historian, I am professionally trained to see things in perspective. I try to. That's my task. And there I see clearly areas of achievement and areas of failure and areas that are very challenging and where we must succeed.
So if there was a putsch tomorrow by the writers of Pakistan, and you were to be made president and Razi maybe as the prime minister with Ahmed Rashid and Daniel Moinuddin and Mohsin as the cabinet, what would be you as the head of the executive branch, what would be your number one?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not about individuals. It is, I mean, the great failure of Pakistan, in my view, has been our failure to build institutions to really meet the requirements of a post-colonial society. This is a post-colonial state, and we need to go beyond the colonial state to generate and create institutions that are responsive to the needs, the emerging needs of the people. That's been the great failure. The imbalance between civil and military institutions is just one of them. But civilian institutions have certainly not functioned to the extent that we need them to function. And I think it's that whole problem of delivery, governance, that is the primary problem and challenge facing Pakistan today.
You've written about the need for mediational institutions.
Well,
what do you mean by that?
See, Pakistanis also have this notion about democracy, that democracy has failed, democracy cannot work until Pakistanis are educated. And I mean, they forget next door India. But what I'll say is that democracy is not some magic wand that you wave occasionally on election time. Democracy is conflict. Democracy is conflict, and countries that have been successful democracies are those that have generated and created institutions that can mediate the conflicts. That is what is done about democracy. Democracy in itself has to be mediated. You can't just sort of not have institutions to mediate, and I think that's where the concentration has to be, and it hasn't happened. Because there is a civil-military imbalance, and within the civilian institutions, we don't have institutions that can actually deliver, with the result that people are very impatient with their elected representatives, not least in a context where they have been fed sort of mantras against politics and politicians. So it's a very negative view. So I do think that this is a self-defeating notion when people say, well, democracy has failed. I mean, there is no such thing as failure in this instance.
You've also talked about some of the failures of the educational system in your work.
Yes, I mean, I've always believed that what Pakistan has needed the most ever since its creation is an educational system that can inculcate in the people of Pakistan the ability to think critically, analytically. Unfortunately, much of our educational system remains, certainly in the public schooling system, remains by rote, with the result that the absence of analytical thinking is very, very severe, which is affecting the future of our youth in their ability to compete internationally. I don't deny there are some, but we need many more. And the vast majority with rote learning are simply not competitive internationally.
And what about the Madrasa system and its effect? The Madrasa system, which has picked up in the sense
Madrasa system is clearly a problem, but I think that in terms of the proportion between Madrasa students and government school students, it's enormous. Madrasas are minuscule compared to the output that government schools. So government schools are the most important issue here. I mean, we need to address the education at government schools.
So in your putsch for power, the education system would be the thing you concentrate on first?
I would sort of bring Ahmed all together, and we need to sort of get the institutional mechanisms going. Institution building is not easy, it's painful, and Pakistanis have a horrific record on institution building. Institution destruction, yes, but not institution building. So I would try to put my mind with him and Mohsin, whoever else is there, to see how we can build institutions.
And obviously this week we've seen bombs going off in Lahore. You, as a historian, have traced the history of the jihad in your remarkable book, Partisans of Allah. Will you just talk a little bit about that book and the historical background before we move forward to the present?
Well, I mean, I was doing a study of faith. I had written a book, Self and Sovereignty, just before Partisans of Allah, in which I had made a distinction between religion as identity and religion as faith, largely for heuristic purposes or analytical purposes, if you prefer. And after I'd written the book, I realized that I really had talked more about religion as identity rather than religion as faith. So when I began thinking about religion as faith, I realized very soon that jihad was at the core of that. Largely because jihad, far from just being war upon others, is actually an ethical concept. So what I'd argued was that jihad actually comes from jahada, the struggle to overcome negative impulses within yourself. So jihad became the focal point, and so I never denied that there were ideas of jihad, militaristic jihad, but I tried to bring out the other ideas of jihad that are as important for people, and it's important to recognize that.
But you also trace, as well as recognizing the ethical concept, you also trace the history
in Pakistan.
On the land that's now Pakistan, way back to Balakot and 1840s. Talk a little about what happened then.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about jihad movements for me is that, contrary to the rhetoric and the ideology around them, when you look at the actual empirical evidence as a historian, it's amazing that Muslims have spent more time killing each other in jihads than infidels, as is supposed to be the case. So I think that's one of the recurrent themes that emerges. The other thing that emerges is that Muslims have never been agreed on what constitutes a jihad. The contestation of whether or not a movement is a jihad or not has been there throughout history. So I think that's very important as well. The third thing I'll say about the book is that it becomes clear in Pakistan's post-independence history that the ideas of jihad as they evolved had less to do with religion per se, and more to do with strategic issues. They were part of strategic security issues. So I think that
we've talked about, in a sense, Pakistan's internal failures, but we haven't mentioned the other elephant in the room, which is the powers surrounding it and the powers around it, which have, notably the Mujahideen movement in the 1980s, and the mass arming by America and Saudi Arabia, and the stockpiling of weapons here. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, yes. I mean, Pakistan has always been in the eye of the storm as a result of global events. And I mean, many of the things that have happened to Pakistan since 1947 have not originated necessarily here, but in other parts of the world. But it has sort of been caught up in the crosshairs of this. And I think, as we know, during the Cold War, Pakistan came under the ambit of the American alliance, which then, towards the closing years of the Cold War, led to this war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And while the Cold War is now over, the legacies are very real and with us still.
And do you think that, in a sense, is the ultimate seed of the violence that we've been seeing even this week in this city?
Well, yes, I think that some of it has turned on the state. It's for strategic reasons, not for religious reasons per se.
And do you think that this is a war that can be won by the Pakistani state?
Yes, if they want to. I think Pakistanis, if they want to, can do so. But I think the biggest problem and the biggest challenge facing Pakistan, sadly, is a mental one. It's the confusion between ideology, between history, between religion and strategic security. I think that there's a great deal of analytical polishing that is needed, and that's somehow absent. And so I do think the other thing that I've already referred to is the depression, the sadness, the tragedy around us. It has made it very difficult for Pakistanis to come together and try to find a way to overcome these challenges, because they're still debating basic things. I'm amazed that after 70 years of partition, we are still debating how and why partition happened, and whether whether Pakistan should be a democracy or authoritarian state. So I think the basic things haven't been sorted out, and this has really impaired Pakistanis in taking the next step and facing the challenges they face today, most notably this violence, and which I say is both existential and conceptual. They need to overcome this. Their future is intrinsically related to overcoming this terror.
Looking forward, what are the signs of optimism on the geopolitical front? I mean, do you think the alliance with China is something that's going to bring peace and help Pakistan, the opening up of the corridor, or is it something you're anxious about?
I wouldn't say that is a given. I think you have to work for that. But I think what has happened is that the Cold War is over, and the abject dependence on the United States of America is over. And I think that is a good thing for Pakistan, and that will mean that Pakistanis, if they are to avoid making the same mistakes with this China relationship, then I think they must draw the lessons from their experience with America, and instead of a dependency relationship, seek a partnership with China, as China wants one. And I think then, and avoid those, the sort of spread of inequity, because American aid only became a means for greater inequity. It was public risk at private sort of profit. And I think that has to stop.
And India, what do you think the future could be for relations with India? I mean,
well, you've come from India, and I think that we can have a conversation. I think that under this particular government, it doesn't look like there are very many opportunities. I also want to point out that the generation that was deeply sort of invested in finding a solution, the generation of Indian politicians, I think, has passed. The new generation, including the current Prime Minister, don't have that same sense of history, the same sense of obligation that men like a Gujral or even a Vajpayee, certainly Manmohan, had. I think the Prime Minister Modi is far less concerned. And certainly the narrative coming out of India for Pakistan is that it was a mistake, it's a failure, and it's an irrelevant country. So I don't think that's a very hopeful way to proceed with Indo-Pak relations.
But it's a very complicated relationship.
Of course.
As an outsider, I'm constantly baffled by it. I've done a lot of work in Israel-Palestine. And if a Palestinian kid ends up on the same corridor as an Israeli kid in a British or American university, they will inevitably be demonstrating against each other. There will be no friendship. They will be enemies. But if a Pakistani and an Indian end up at a university in the United States, they will be playing each other Bollywood records, they'll be looking in each other's rooms, looking at the cricket match.
They'll be sitting in my classroom listening to my lectures.
Exactly, yeah. And whenever individual Indians go to Pakistan or Pakistanis go to India, there's enormous hospitality and warmth.
But I mean, that's what I was saying, that as individual citizens, it's important to understand the foundational myths of our nation states and make our choices. I think those who wish to reach out and get to understand people in other countries, including India or Bangladesh, need to understand what the foundational myth does to you. Not to reject it necessarily, but to at least analytically know what it is doing and still have the capacity to reach beyond it. I think that's what we don't do well when we simply don't think about those foundational myths.
But you are fundamentally optimistic about this country. This country is here to stay. This country will prosper.
You know, I hate to say this, but I just don't think that anybody is interested in Pakistan. I think that what's important to realize is how this country was created. And I don't want to go back to a book I wrote 30 years ago again. But there is still a real sort of struggle to come to terms with that book and understand what happened. Pakistan effectively was, as I've always said, cut away from India because they didn't want to share power. So in that sense, they solved the Muslim problem by dividing rather than sharing power. So I don't see how the fear of India makes sense here, because while India might want to weaken Pakistan, it certainly doesn't want to bring these areas back in its midst and complicate its own Muslim problem in India.
This year we've seen Brexit and the beginning of a possible dissolution or a cracking of the European Union. Do you see any hope in the future for a SARC which becomes a genuinely cross-national body that can promote economic discussion and a free
William,
trade?
It's not going to happen out of the blue. There's no inevitability there, obviously, and there are some long-standing problems between India and Pakistan, notably Kashmir. And I think, let me just also emphasize the importance of the people of Kashmir as votaries in this. And until those are addressed, I just don't see where this relationship is going. It's not going to go anywhere.
So what would you say, just to conclude, I know you want to open it up to questions early, what are your main sources of optimism for the future in this country?
Well, I think that Pakistan has weathered many storms in its history. It has also learned some lessons, which I would like to sort of reiterate. And one of the most important lessons that we've learned is that, it's easier to vote out a democratically elected government than one that comes in through military means, authoritarian means. And I think people have realized that even military rulers need to be legitimate. Even they seek legitimacy. So we've learned that they don't necessarily have the solutions, and that both the military and the civilian arms will have to work together. The challenge is to find the institutional mechanisms that will be suitable for the needs of Pakistan. So I'm not saying that it's all rosy. It's a question of the Pakistanis being willing to take up the challenge rather than sitting on their backs and saying, let manna come down from heaven. You're going to have to do it yourself. I mean, that's how countries have been made, by citizens coming together, fighting for their consumer rights, fighting for things and getting things to improve.
Speaking for myself as an outsider, a major source of optimism seems to be what we have here in front of us.
Yes.
The fact that this festival has survived,
Yes.
has weathered the storms of this week. And so I think a big round of applause, please, for Ayesha, Jalal. Before we open it to questions, have the lights on, please. House lights up. Could we have microphones and the lights up, please? Until they come, with the first question, I'd like to come forward.
Don't see anything. Sure, they can.
Yeah, okay.
Is there no light? आप उर्दू में भी सवाल कर सकते हैं, अगर करना चाहें तो.
There's someone waving from the front here. You've got to come forward and shout, and we can repeat the question. We have the house lights on, please. Sir, come forward.
Can we just get it? Light is just a killer.
Yeah. Can we have this one spotlight off and the lights on? Thank you. More, please. No.
Yeah.
Academic history. Pakistanis are producing, as I speak, very good works of history, maybe not in as large numbers as their Indian counterparts, but those research-based histories do not make it in the textbooks. The textbooks of Pakistan are ideologically oriented. They are not historically grounded. The interest is not to teach history, but to teach ideology. So it's on a different plane altogether. So yes, while I was approached some years ago to comment on a history textbook or the history curriculum, I'm not working on history textbooks. That's a political decision. As a professional historian, I work on a kind of history that is not going to find its way, and I am not a politician.
Okay.
This gentleman here in the second row.
The question relates to the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran in context of Pakistan as we go forward.
Well, I think it's really important to remind you that whilst it's commonplace to refer to this relationship as one of age-old or ancient conflicts, that history shows you that as I mean, as sort of late as, sort of recently as the Nixon period, the Nixon Doctrine. What was the Nixon Doctrine? The Nixon Doctrine was that America's foreign policy in the Persian Gulf was based on Saudi Arabia and Iran. They were allies of the United States of America. So this rivalry that you're talking about that has impacted Pakistan so much is really a 1979 onwards issue, for the most part. You can push it a little bit to the quadrupling of oil prices, but effectively the 70s. So it's a very recent phenomena, and the coming apart of this alliance and the United States' antipathy towards Iran and Saudi, the building up of Saudi Arabia is really one of the major factors. So I think that it's important to understand why this is now a problem and wasn't there earlier. To just see this as an age-old sectarian problem is a huge mistake, because it will not enable you to find an answer to it.
Over here. Yep.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम मैम। मैम खालिद खान हूँ, मैं कोयटा से मेरा ताल्लुक है। मेरा क्वेश्चन ये पाकिस्तान की मौजूदा सूरत-ए-हाल के मुतालिक है।
आपकी आवाज़ नहीं आ रही है ज़रा।
खालिद खान हूँ, कोयटा से मेरा ताल्लुक है, बलूचिस्तान से। खालिद खान, मेरा सवाल ये है कि सबसे ज़्यादा कुर्बानियाँ पाकिस्तान में दहशतगर्दी के खात्मे के लिए फाटा, खैबर पख्तूनख्वा और बलूचिस्तान की आवाम ने दी है। 60,000 के लगभग लोग जाँ बहक हो चुके हैं दहशतगर्दी को ख़त्म करने के सिलसिले में। मौजूदा जो भी इंसिडेंट हुआ जाता है पाकिस्तान में, या कोयटा में, या कराची में, या लाहौर में, तो इल्ज़ाम अफ़गान रिफ्यूजीज़ और पश्तो स्पीकिंग पीपल्स के ऊपर लगाया जाता है, यानी कि उनके खिलाफ एटनेस और फैलाई जाती है, प्रोपेगेंडा किया जाता है। मैम, क्या यह प्रोपेगेंडा अफ़गान रिफ्यूजीज़ और पश्तो स्पीकिंग अफराद के खिलाफ पाकिस्तान की हेल्प कर पाएगा, या पाकिस्तान के यानी कि अफ़गानिस्तान की सूरत में एक और दुश्मन मुल्क बन जाएगा? यानी कि इंडिया से हम नफरत करते हैं पूरे मुल्क, तो अफगानिस्तान भी हमारे लिए नफरत की निगाह से देखा जाएगा।
सवाल क्या है? आप अपना सवाल कीजिए।
मैम, सवाल ये है कि पश्तो स्पीकिंग अफराद के खिलाफ, पश्तो स्पीकिंग नेशन के खिलाफ जो प्रोपेगेंडा किया जा रहा है टेररिज्म का, जैसे दुनिया में मुस्लिम को टेररिस्ट शो किया जाता है, पाकिस्तान में पश्तून को टेररिस्ट शो किया जाता है, क्या ये प्रोपेगेंडा पाकिस्तान की हेल्प कर पाएगा इंटरनेशनल सिनारियो में?
देखिए, आई डोंट नो विच प्रोपेगेंडा आप किसके साथ किसके आप इशारा किस तरफ है, क्योंकि जहाँ तक टेररिज्म का सवाल है वहाँ पे पश्तो लोग भी मर रहे हैं। ये तो बात गलत है कि कहना कि वो मार रहे हैं या अफगान मार रहे हैं, सब मर रहे हैं। तो इसमें तो कोई प्रोपेगेंडा जो जिसकी भी आप बात कर रहे हैं, वो आप उसको आइडेंटिफाई करें कौन से प्रोपेगेंडा की बात कर रहे हैं आप।
मैम, प्रोपेगेंडा अब लाहौर में चेयरिंग क्रॉस पे धमाका हुआ, तो उसके बाद ये गुजरात में और मंडी बाउदी में ये इश्तिहार लगाए थे।
देखिए, ये तो चल रहा है
जी मैम।
किसी एक कौम के खिलाफ नहीं है, या तो सारे आप लोग यहाँ पे इतने लोग मरे हैं, पश्तो भी मर रहे हैं, सब मर रहे हैं, तो टेररिज्म के खिलाफ है। आई डोंट थिंक किसी एक कौम के खिलाफ है।
Can we have this gentleman here standing up with the black T-shirt? Can we have a question from a woman after that? Any women? Hands up from women questioners. You're a gentleman. One in the back here. Next question from there. After this gentleman in the black. Keep standing if you would.
That guy क्या होता है यार? सुनो ना, कोई बात नहीं।
No, not you. The gentleman in the black T-shirt.
मैडम, मेरा सवाल आपसे सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री पे बिलोंग करता है।
सॉरी?
देखिए, सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री, देखें, वी पाकिस्तानी मस्ट हैव ए सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री। हमने ये जो पार्टीशन का सो कॉल्ड अनफिनिश्ड एजेंडा कह के मसाइल क्रिएट किए हुए हैं, हमने अननेसेसरीली इंडिया के साथ ताल्लुकात ख़राब किए हुए हैं। अगर हम हिस्टोरिकली देखें तो हमारा मतलब, आई एम नॉट कॉन्ट्रडिक्टिंग, लेकिन मैं उनकी सारी बात को मैं थोड़ा सा कहता हूँ, हमारी तो इशू अफगानिस्तान के साथ रहा है। अफगान्स दे हैव ऑलवेज इन्वेडेड, या उनकी जो भी जिस तरह की नेशनैलिटीज़ थी वहाँ, इन्होंने टिल पंजाब इन्होंने हमेशा ये इन्वेड किया है। और एज फार एज बैक 250 years बिफोर रंजीत सिंह।
आप अपना सवाल कीजिए। तो
मेरा सवाल ये है कि
नहीं है यहाँ पर।
अच्छा, मेरा सवाल ये है कि शुड वी फाइंड अ बेटर इक्वेशन विद इंडिया, बस दैट्स इट।
देखिए, इट टेक्स 2 hands टू क्लैप। पाकिस्तान अकेला कुछ नहीं कर सकता।
Assalamu alaikum ji. It's a two-fold question. Part one, what do you think of Radul Fasad, this new operation that's been led? What's your analysis? Is this
Excuse me?
What is your analysis of Radul Fasad, this new operation that's been started? Is this just a rebranding of Zarb-e-Azb, or do you see something in this? And second fold, talking about ideology-based or analytical histories, what do you think of the book that came last year that was either really positively reviewed or very critical?
I'm sorry, I really can't understand you.
So the first question was about the armies. What do you think of the new operation by the army?
It's not so new. It's been going on for 2 years, first of all, and it was a necessary operation. I mean, you had to do this in order to eliminate many of the sanctuaries. It's obviously not the only thing that is needed. There's much more to be done.
I meant Zarb-e-Azb. Do you think it's just a rebranding of Zarb-e-Azb, or do you think because we've had the military and civil...
It's a continuation. The problem is the same. It has different layers to it. So that's, if you're saying is it continuing the same vein, yes, it is. Yeah.
And what do you think of the Venkat Dhulipala book that's been taking ground since last year? Creating a New Medina by Venkat Dhulipala.
I just don't understand what he's saying.
No, one question. Ladies' turn now.
I can't understand you.
Thank you.
What do you, your analysis of the book Venkat Dhulipala is Creating a New Medina?
That book has been made much of, and his argument that there were many ideas about Pakistan does not refute what I said, which is that the lack of clarity on the demand for Pakistan allowed various people to make of it what they wished. Now that does not, whatever he's saying, his problem there is that he cannot prove that all that was argued about Pakistan was actually sanctioned by the Muslim League. And so he has to historically show that what was being thought about in Medina terms in UP then had a carryover into post-independence Pakistan. You can't just look at random things. Agar aap Bengal jaएं, you will see that in Bengal similar sorts of ideas existed. What you need to show is how those ideas then had an impact in the post-47 scenario. You can't just randomly put up ideas and say, oh, this was really thought through. You see what I'm trying to get at?
This lady next here, lady in the black shirt, please.
Hi ma'am, my name is Durin Ayab and I'm from Daily Times. What the guy from Quetta was actually referring to was the racial profiling that has been going on against...
I really, these
asking about racial profiling.
I'll just scream.
Come forward.
Come forward and talk, because I can't understand this.
Right.
Racial profiling.
Exactly. What my brother was talking about was the racial profiling against Pashtun nationals that has been going on ever since the Afghan War. And that is what I wanted to...
Keep going. It's all right. Keep going. I'll repeat it. Keep going.
All right. And that is what I wanted to ask as well. When we say that Pakistan is not failing, is it the Pakistan as a whole which is not failing, or is it Pakistan...
Let me just talk to you about failure.
Hang on. Can I just repeat the question? The question was about racial profiling of Pashtuns by the state.
Well, in terms of failure, when you talk about Pakistan failing by what standards? Your standards, American standards, British standards, Indian standards. I think you need to understand what you mean by failing and failure. Now, as far as racial profiling is concerned, it's of course to be regretted. But human beings tend to do that if there are a succession of attacks that can be linked to people who unfortunately fit that profile. What do you think is happening in America? I mean, much the same sort of thing is happening to you. No, of course, it's deplorable, so fight it. The point is not to declare Pakistan a failed state that you should pack up and leave. You need to get up and do something about it.
After this guy.
Assalamu alaikum.
Gentleman in the black.
Ma'am, my name is Kia Gorgej and I'm from Gawadar. As being a historian, as you are a historian and I've read your book, Struggle for Pakistan. So, ma'am, as being a student from Balochistan, so Balochistan, the people of Balochistan and the politicians, the nationalists there, they had a huge contribution in the history of Pakistan. So as being a big historian, so in that book, the history of Pakistan, so there I didn't find a single account for the people of Balochistan, for the historians of Balochistan, as during the time of NAP. So there the nationalist leader Gozbak Bizenjo don't you think he had a big, huge contribution?
Of course, and the point here that you don't understand is that everything is about perspective. I was asked to write a book on Pakistan. So I wrote about the most dominant themes that have shaped Pakistan, of which one of them is the center region tussle. So Balochistan's question comes there. Now, if you want to write about Balochistan and the people of Balochistan, or students want to write about Balochistan, they must. I have to, as a historian, provide perspective, and everything has to be balanced in that
So,
context.
ma'am, in your, according to you, in your whole book,
Just one
there
question,
wasn't
please.
a single perspective which would be counted there
No,
in
it
this.
is a thematic study. It is not in any detail about any single province. It is a general book.
Thank you.
And it's time that you understand the difference between a monograph and a general book.
And
I'll be
lady in white.
I'll be quick. You wrote this article. It's called History and Official Imagining. I wanted to ask a question about that. That you critique about everything, our educational system, the history which is like the idealism which is in it and all that. So aren't you basically giving your own theory in it, like something like that? Because that's what the critique that comes in when we do critique on that.
I mean, so you're saying, am I putting my own theory? I'm only analyzing what is there. I mean, it's not a question of my theory. I'm looking at evidence and analyzing it and saying this is what it looks like. This is what they're doing in the history books. That's analysis and not my opinion.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And there's a big difference between your opinion and mine because I study history.
The lady first, and then the gentleman with the ponytail.
Sorry, I'm not going
A
to
feisty Punjabi Sherni.
I'm not going to ask a question. I'm all for the youth of this country. This child was the first one to put their hand up. Here you are.
To you is that to what extent do you believe in this society where we're all so confined and not being able to do what you think you want to, as a teenager, I'm in your mind, and who wants to write about all the emotions that I have within myself. My question to you is, how far do you think?
So the question was, how far does Ayesha think that this is a country where you can express yourself freely as an 18-year-old poet without censorship?
Well, I think you have to keep pushing the parameters of censorship. And it's not just about sort of accepting them, the ways to sort of create space. Life is about limitations, and the challenge of life is to get rid of those limitations. So that is the struggle that I would advise you to engage with. It's not a one thing. It can't happen with a one sort of one act. It's a series of acts of resistance. When you think differently, you push limits. And when you push them successfully, you will have more space, and those who've come after you will be able to do the same. So you have to constantly battle for that space.
Which is as true of India as it is of Pakistan.
And any country. It's true of any country.
Gentleman here.
Professor Ayesha Jalal, when you wrote a book which was perceived against the Pakistani military establishment, they gave you a tough time.
Which one? Which book are you referring to?
Just forgetting the title, but which was primarily about their industrial ventures and all that.
Sorry?
Industrial ventures.
Sorry?
Industrial ventures and...
but there's no point of reference, is the point. I mean, which book are you referring to?
So can we have next, please, the gentleman with the blue shirt?
He's forgotten the name. Yes, go ahead.
Hello.
After it, the gentleman standing on his tiptoes in the running jacket at the back.
Hello. My name is Abdurrahman, and my question is, currently we have a situation where the right is refusing to engage with the left and the left reciprocating. And with this void in communication and the fact that the right is much stronger than the left, do you see that in the coming years, Pakistan might be turning into a state like Saudi Arabia or Iran?
Nothing stays the same. All that goes around comes around. In the 70s, early 70s, when you were not even born probably, the world was at a different point in its different conjuncture. The critique of capitalism, and there was a left surge, which kind of petered away in the mid-70s for particular reasons. Now, there's nothing to say that there isn't a counter movement underway against what is known as neoliberalism. So I do think that nothing stays the same. So when you talk about who's strong and who's weak, I will not venture to support either, but it only corroborates my point that societies are by nature conflicted. And because there's conflict, you must have mediational institutions. That's this point. And that is where Pakistan has had a severe deficit in creating institutions that can mediate conflicts without inviting severe kinds of reactions like military authoritarianism, direct military authoritarianism. That is what the failure is. And I think that's what you have to learn from the 70 years of your history. No, I don't think so. I think Saudi Arabia has its own set of configurations. And if you think that veneers of religiosity turn you into Saudi Arabia, I think you will be severely disappointed.
Gentleman in the back with the running suit.
बोलिए जी
एक पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू के मुताबिक पाकिस्तान की चाइना के $6 बिलियन जो है एड है सॉफ्ट लोन है कि इन्वेस्टमेंट है
जी इट्स एन इन्वेस्टमेंट प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट
टोटल
जी
टोटल एड सॉफ्ट लोन है
His question is CPAC a private investment, a loan, or what? And I'm saying it's a private investment.
Next question here.
Madam
Last
Ayesha,
question, I'm afraid.
Is CPAC will be turned as the East India Company for Pakistan or
Sorry?
not?
Sorry?
CPAC will become an East India Company for Pakistan? East India Company?
Look, I mean, these are kinds of statements that are missing many levels. Yes, CPAC can end up being a disaster if the people of Pakistan if they're not vigilant, if they don't fight for what is, to hold their representatives accountable, then yes, it will not be facilitating democracy. It will only facilitate more of what Pakistan has had for 70 years. But if you want a change, then I suggest that people have to get together and express themselves and organize themselves and state what they dislike about the way things are going. Nothing is going to change unless you want it to change.
Last question now. This lady here.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I was just listening to you guys and I was thinking, why do we have such a low opinion of Pakistan? Pakistan is a great country. We're not a failed state. And thank you. We are a resilient nation. I mean, so many other bad things are happening in other countries and it's not being, magnified as much as it is in Pakistan. I live in Chicago. Every day in Chicago's south side, about 8 to 10 African Americans die. But is anyone saying that America is a failed state? No, nobody is saying that. We should look at our strong points also. We have a lot of strong points. We have a beautiful country. We have people who are the most hospitable people in the world. I mean, I'm sure Mr. Dalrymple would bear with me. We are the most hospitable people in the world. If anybody comes here, they are going to be given 3 cups of tea, right? So I just want to make sure that we stay positive.
I mean, everything is about perspective.
You also have the best cooking, by the way.
Everything is about perspective. And
Thank you.
And I agree that the notion of failed states, and I mean, it doesn't make much sense. I think there's much in Pakistan that is very, very positive. But there are also many things that are not positive. And a citizenry, it is their task that rather than sort of sitting and simply complaining, to do something about it. One of the ways to do it is not simply organizing political strikes, but perhaps coming together as consumers. If you look at the history of democracies the world over, it has been consumer defense leagues that have been at the heart of the political democracies. I think Pakistanis, instead of simply letting things happen to them, have to be more proactive and respond.
A big round of applause, please, for Ayesha Jalal. Next up in here, we have Shabnam Ghosh with Sarmad Kushat.